I've lived my whole life in eastern Kentucky, in a hollow so deep and narrow the sun only touches the valley floor for a few hours each day, even in summer. The village I grew up in doesn't have a name anymore, not one that shows up on maps or that anyone outside the hollow would recognize. There were maybe 40 people living there when I was young, most of them related to me in some way, all of us descendants of families that had worked these mountains since before the Civil War. The land was poor, the coal long gone, and the young people left as soon as they were able, but some of us stayed. We didn't have much choice. The mountains hold on to you in ways that are hard to explain to people who didn't grow up in them. The well sat behind the old Methodist church, a stone structure that hadn't held services since my grandfather was a boy. The building itself was still standing, barely, the roof sagging in the middle and the windows broken out, but the well remained. It was old, older than the church by at least a century, hand-dug sometime in the 1700s when the first settlers came through the gap and decided this hollow was far enough from everything else that they could disappear into it. The stones that lined the well shaft were fitted together without mortar, each one worn smooth by time and weather, and the whole structure was maybe 4 feet across, with a low rim that came up to my waist. By the time I was born, the well had been dry for decades. My grandmother said it went dry in the summer of 1952, right after a little girl named Sarah Mullins fell in and drowned before anyone could get her out. They pulled her body up 3 days later, bloated and broken, and after that people stopped using the well. Said the water tasted wrong even before it stopped flowing altogether. By the time I was old enough to remember, the well was just this dark hole behind a dead church, surrounded by blackberry vines and poison ivy that had grown so thick over the stone rim it looked like the earth itself was trying to pull it back down, to cover it over and forget it had ever been there. I was 19 that autumn, still living in my grandmother's house at the edge of the village, working part-time at a gas station 30 miles down the mountain and trying to save enough money to leave, though I never seemed to get any closer to having enough. My parents had died when I was 12, a car accident on the switchback road that led out of the hollow, and my grandmother had raised me after that in the same house where she'd been born, where her mother had been born before her. She was in her 80s by then, still sharp in the mind but failing in body, and I knew I couldn't leave her, not really, no matter how much I told myself I would. It was early October when it started, that brief window when the leaves are turning but haven't fallen yet, when the air gets cold enough at night to burn your lungs but the days are still warm, and the fog rolls in from the creek every morning like something living, thick and white and so heavy you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. The village well had its own spring-fed source back when it was flowing, but for household water, we'd been using the creek for as long as anyone could remember, hauling it up in buckets and boiling it before drinking. It was my job to fetch the water each morning before my grandmother woke, 2 buckets at a time, a quarter mile down the old footpath to where the creek ran clear over smooth stones. That morning, the fog was worse than usual, so thick I could barely see the path under my feet, the world reduced to gray shapes and the sound of my own breathing. I'd made the walk 1,000 times and didn't need to see to know where I was going, my feet finding the worn dirt path automatically, the bucket swinging empty at my sides. But something felt wrong that morning. The air was too still, too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds. No wind rattling the branches. Just the muffled sound of my footsteps and the slow drip of condensation from the leaves overhead. I was maybe halfway to the creek when I heard it. A voice. Faint and distant, coming from somewhere behind me back toward the village. At first I thought it was my grandmother calling for me, that maybe she'd woken up early and needed something, but the voice was wrong. Too hollow, too echoing like it was coming from somewhere deep and enclosed. I stopped walking, my heart already beating faster than it should have been, and I listened. It came again. Not words exactly, but sounds shaped like words, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like speech. And underneath it, I could hear other sounds, layered and overlapping like multiple voices calling at once but not quite in sync. They were coming from the direction of the old church. From the well. I should have kept walking. Should have gone to the creek, filled my buckets and gone home. But there was something in those voices, something urgent and desperate, that pulled at me in a way I couldn't explain. I set the buckets down at the edge of the path and turned back, moving slowly through the fog, my hands out in front of me to push aside the branches that I couldn't see until I was almost touching them. The church materialized out of the mist like a ghost, its dark shape looming against the gray sky, the collapsed roof giving it a broken, skeletal appearance. The well was behind it, just visible through the tangle of vines and undergrowth, the stone rim barely poking above the vegetation. And the voices were louder now, clear enough that I could almost make out words, rising from the well shaft in hollow echoes that seemed to bounce off the stones and multiply as they climbed. I pushed through the blackberry vines, thorns catching on my jacket and tearing at my hands, until I was standing at the rim looking down into the shaft. It was completely dark down there, the kind of absolute black that feels like a physical presence, like if you stared at it too long it might start staring back. But the voices were clear now. Names. They were calling out names over and over, some of them I recognized and some I didn't. I heard my grandmother's name, my mother's name, and then I heard mine. My name, rising from the darkness in a dozen different voices, all of them desperate, all of them pleading. "Help us," they said. "Pull us up." The words echoed against the stone walls of the shaft, distorting and multiplying until it sounded like 100 people were down there, all calling at once, all begging to be saved. My hands gripped the edge of the well, the stone cold and slick with moisture, and I leaned forward, trying to see something, anything in the darkness below. There was movement down there. I couldn't see it, not exactly, but I could sense it, a shifting in the black that suggested shapes, bodies, hands reaching upward. And there was a smell rising from the well, faint but unmistakable. Damp earth, stagnant water. And underneath it all, something sweet and rotten, like meat that had been left out in the sun. I knew I should run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from that well, to put as much distance between myself and those voices as possible. But I was frozen, my hands locked on the stone rim, my eyes fixed on the darkness below. And then I heard it. A splash. Faint and wet, like something moving through shallow water at the bottom of the shaft. And then another splash, and I realized with a horror that made my stomach turn that whatever was down there was climbing. Coming up toward me. I let go of the well and stumbled backward, my feet catching on the vines, and I went down hard on my back, the air knocked out of my lungs. The voices grew louder, more insistent, the words blurring together into a single sustained cry that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the voices followed me. Not from the well anymore. They were in the ground, seeping up through the soil beneath my feet, muffled and distorted but still calling my name, still begging to be pulled up. I could feel them under me as I ran, a presence moving through the earth, tracking me, following the vibrations of my footsteps. I made it back to my grandmother's house and slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I stood in the kitchen, listening, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it. A low murmur, barely audible, coming from the sink. I walked over slowly, my legs weak, and I leaned close to the drain. Voices. Rising from the pipes. The same voices from the well, faint and hollow, echoing up through the plumbing. I turned the tap on, and the water that came out was cold and clear, but I could hear them underneath it, whispering my name, pleading with me in words I could almost but not quite understand. I turned the water off and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The murmuring continued, seeping from every drain in the house, from the kitchen sink and the bathroom and the old wash basin in the back room. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, a low background whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My grandmother came down the stairs an hour later, moving slowly with her cane, and she found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the sink. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just looked at me with those sharp old eyes and said, "You went to the well." It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she sat down across from me, her hands folded on the table. She was quiet for a long time and then she told me about the well and the people who'd gone into it over the years. Not just Sarah Mullins in 1952. Before her there'd been others. A man named Thomas Webb who'd fallen in during a storm in 1923 and drowned before anyone knew he was missing. A woman named Catherine somebody whose last name my grandmother couldn't remember, who'd climbed down to retrieve a dropped bucket in 1901 and never climbed back up. And before that, names lost to time, people who'd vanished and been forgotten, but whose voices, my grandmother said, never left the well. She said the well was hungry. That it had been dug too deep, cut through layers of limestone and shale into something older, something that didn't want to be disturbed. She said it called to people, especially when the fog was thick and the boundaries between things got thin, and that once it called your name it wouldn't stop. Not until you gave it what it wanted. I asked her what it wanted, though I already knew the answer. She just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sadness and resignation and said, "It wants you to come down. To pull up the ones already there. But if you do, you'll take their place. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." The voices in the pipes grew quieter as the day wore on, fading to almost nothing by noon when the sun finally burned through the fog and filled the house with light. But they didn't disappear completely. I could still hear them if I listened closely, A faint murmur underneath the normal sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards and the tick of the old clock in the hallway. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I listened to the whispers coming from the bathroom down the hall, my name repeated over and over in voices that sounded almost familiar, almost like people I should know. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and went to the kitchen, turned on every light, and sat at the table with my hands pressed flat against the wood, trying to anchor myself to something solid and real. The next morning I capped every drain in the house, stuffed rags into the sinks and the bathtub and poured wax over them to seal them shut. It helped a little. The voices were muffled, distant, but I could still feel them, a vibration in the pipes that I could sense more than hear. I stopped going near the church, stopped walking the paths that led past it. I took a longer route to the creek for water, adding 20 minutes to the walk each way just to avoid getting close to that well. But it didn't matter. The voices found me anyway. In the drip of condensation from the eaves. In the sound of rain running through the gutters. In the slow trickle of the creek itself. They were everywhere water flowed, waiting, calling, patient. My grandmother died that winter. Heart failure, the doctor said, peaceful in her sleep. But I knew better. I'd heard her getting up in the middle of the night in the weeks before she died, heard her moving slowly down the stairs and out the front door, and in the morning she'd come back with mud on her nightgown and a vacant look in her eyes that scared me more than the voices ever had. I think she went to the well. I think she finally answered the call. I left the hollow 3 days after we buried her. Packed what I could carry and walked out, didn't look back. I live in Lexington now, in an apartment building with city water that comes from a treatment plant 30 miles away, and I tell myself I'm safe here, that whatever was in that well can't reach me this far from the mountains. But I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the building is quiet and everyone else is asleep, I'll hear a murmur from the pipes in the walls. Faint and hollow, like voices calling from very far away. And in the bathroom, if I turn the tap on and lean close, I can almost make out words. My name. The same desperate pleading I heard that morning in the fog. I keep the drains plugged now. Hardly ever use the water. I buy bottled water from the store and I don't shower unless I absolutely have to. And even then I run the water as hot as it will go and I don't listen. Don't let myself hear what might be underneath the sound of the spray. But it's getting harder. The voices are getting louder, more insistent. They're in the pipes at work now. In the fountain at the park. In the rain when it hits the pavement. They're spreading, reaching further, or maybe I'm just finally hearing what was always there. I don't know what happens if I answer. Don't know what I'd see if I went back to that well and looked down into the darkness. But I think about it. More than I should. Because the voices are familiar now. I recognize them. My grandmother is down there. My mother. People I knew and people I didn't, all of them calling from the black, all of them wanting to be pulled up, wanting someone to take their place so they can finally leave. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is that I'm starting to understand them. Starting to hear not just the pleading but the promise underneath it. That if I go down, if I take their place, the voices will stop. The calling will end. I'll finally have silence. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The pull is getting stronger. And I'm so tired. So tired of hearing them, of running, of trying to pretend that I'm not connected to that well and everything in it. Maybe tomorrow I'll drive back to the hollow. Stand at the rim and look down one more time. See if the darkness is still waiting. See if the voices will finally tell me what they really want. Or maybe I already know. Maybe I've always known. And maybe that's why I haven't gone back yet. Because once I do, once I answer that call and lean too far over the edge, there won't be any coming back. I'll be down there with the rest of them, calling up through the dark, begging the next person to pull us up, knowing they never will. The voices rise again from the sink drain. Soft, patient, waiting. They have all the time in the world. And I'm running out.